Hello and welcome to the Bestseller Experiment, a special deep dive episode that we record exclusively for our academates on the Bestseller Academy and our patrons over on Patreon. And very special guest today, I've got Stuart Gibbon here. Stuart is a former UK senior police detective who served in London and the East Midlands. In 2014, he launched his own business providing a consultancy service for writers. Stuart also appears on TV and radio as a policing expert. His website, Gibb Consultancy, is a goldmine of advice for anyone researching crime fiction, and I'll put a link in the show notes so you can check that out. He's also co-written a series of books with Stephen Wade, the Crime Writers Casebook, Being a Detective and Catching a Killer, and also a series of indispensable guides on criminal investigation procedures. Stuart, welcome to the podcast. How are you today, sir?
I'm very well, Mark. Thanks very much for inviting me. Looking forward to chatting.
Excellent stuff. Well, we've got a bunch of listener questions as well, which have been sent in, and hopefully you've had time to have a look at. And I've got two here, which are essentially asking the same thing. And it's the first question I usually ask of any expert that I talk to when I'm researching something. So the first one's from Gavin Ralph, who said, "What do crime novels and TV dramas often get wrong?" And in a similar vein, Christopher Wills says, "What's the worst or funniest case of police procedure you've seen for UK cops on TV? You know, the kind that makes you want to throw something at the screen." So what are writers getting wrong, Stuart? What are we getting wrong that you see over and over again?
I think if anybody knows something about a particular subject and you're watching the telly or you're reading a book and you see something that isn't quite right, I'm sure there are people who don't, but I've certainly fallen into the camp that you're kind of jumping up saying, you know, that would never happen. What on earth are they doing that? So it's quite common. In police procedure, I think one of the things to bear in mind that I always say when I talk about this sort of area is that your TV programs, so your crime dramas and things like that, sometimes they're set over many weeks, but often the actual episode's like an hour, maybe 2 hours maximum. And in that time, they've got to have the lead detective charging around, interviewing everybody and arresting people. And they've got to find the person responsible as well. So there's quite a bit of artistic license involved there in relation to what they do in terms of what happens really. But the thing that really does me, in a way, is the one where I do jump up on the seat, is around contamination of let's say a crime scene. Let's say we've got a murder and the body is still in situ, and you've got all the forensic team, and often it's quite well portrayed because you'll have them with all the gear on. They'll have the white suits, they'll have the masks, they'll have the foot covers and the gloves, and they'll be taking photographs, and then suddenly the detective in charge will come traipsing into the crime scene and just, "Oh, what's that?" and just lean over the body with a pen or something and just have a little poke around and say, "Well, that's interesting." They've got something in their mouth, and that's the kind of thing that is obviously a big no-no, and it could be covered in a way by just putting some little bit of extra things around kind of forensic contamination. But that's a big one for me. It's about everybody else is dressed and everybody's doing the right thing. But I won't name names, obviously, but we all know these sort of people are. The star of the show is in there all over it, and then comes out again, and there's no real kind of there's nothing to show, the fact that the scene's been contaminated. So I would say that's probably one for me that makes me kind of cringe a little bit. Understand why they do it, because if you've got your lead actor, you want to see their face, you want to see them talking, you don't really want to have a mask on, but then it drifts away from reality a little bit. And another one that's a bit of a favourite of mine, which if you bear it in mind and you think in future, you may have noticed it already, but if ever you see an interview scene in a police station, you can virtually guarantee that there'll be a uniformed police officer somewhere within that room, standing with a back to the wall, or maybe as they leave the room, outside the room. And again, I think that's just kind of a visual aid, because it's something that in reality would never happen. I've never known it in all my years of interviewing people. It'd be nice to have those spare officers to stand in the room. Yes. But actually, it never happens. There's an alarm strip in the room. So if something does happen, there is a bit of violence or threats and you need help, you press the alarm strip and people come charging to help you. There isn't any real need for a uniformed officer. But it looks kind of good on telly when you watch it, because the officer doesn't do anything, very rarely speaks, but just kind of stands there with their arms behind their back, just kind of looking good, if you like. So I'd say that there are a couple of things, really. They're not massive things, but to me they would be, because in the real world, these things are kind of not so much the interview one, but certainly the forensic. It's you get one chance at it, and that's why it takes so long to examine particularly a murder scene, because it's fingertip, and you know once you've released that scene, you can't then go back and do it all again. Well, you can, but it's clearly contaminated. So for me, that's a kind of biggie, and you do sometimes see it in books. It's quite rare in a crime novel, a fictional novel, for people to make reference to the forensic gear, which is that's what would happen. So my advice in relation to those sort of things, if you've got people going into the crime scene or already working there, it's really nice to paint a picture for the reader. Say, you know, they've got their white suits on and it's a hot day and everybody's sweating and it's uncomfortable, because it really is when you wear them. You know, and the fact that they've got all the right gear, and I think it just paints a picture for the reader, and it just makes it a little bit more realistic.
So your consultancy, people can send you their novels for you to consult on. And again, what are the common mistakes in fiction, putting TV to one side, because obviously that has pacing issues and there's reasons they do that. But in a book, you've got a bit more room to breathe. What are the mistakes that, you know, when people send their books to you, what are you seeing come up again and again?
I think one of them is the language that's used, not the obscene language, but the way that police officers talk to each other. Right. I think there's a kind of perception that it's very military and it's very formal, and you know all the senior officers are barking orders at the junior colleagues, and in reality it's much more relaxed than that. And right. I do see quite a lot that people use last names. So you know it's like, rather than saying officer, or that term isn't used really. The term detective. I mean, if you were a detective and I was a senior detective, I wouldn't say, you know, Detective State, can you just go and do this for me? It never happens. And the word detective on its own is more of an American term, really, than a UK term. So I'd say, really and truly, there is some respect and there is some discipline, but it's fairly informal. So me as a detective chief inspector in charge of a murder, I wouldn't be called chief inspector. I wouldn't be called DCI. Not face to face. I'd be called things like Gov, short for governor, or even governor, boss, those sort of things. So it's a bit more informal. And I would refer to junior colleagues by the first names. It really is conversational. It's much more, even if I was asking them to do something or giving them some kind of instructions, it's really much more informal. And I think sometimes when I read the notes that I'm sent, it's very much, you know, Smith this and Jones that, and, you know, barking orders. And all right, people do get shouted at from time to time, but it's, you know, it's the realism of it is everybody's working as a team, and it's much more informal. Although there is this understanding that some people are more senior in rank and have more responsibility and accountability than others. I think probably another one maybe around the role of the coroner, without going too deep into it. But basically, the coroner is a very important person who deals with people when they've died, and they deal with the family, and they're in charge of inquests and things like that. But what the coroner certainly does not do is have any involvement with a police investigation, and they certainly don't carry out a post-mortem. And I think sometimes people get the coroner and the pathologist mixed up. It's the pathologist that carries out the post-mortem. They provide a written report. They go to court and give evidence on their findings. But it's the coroner that sits above this process in terms of the death of a person, whether it's suspicious or otherwise. And I think sometimes people think coroner, think of death, and then think they do everything, wherein in fact it's they're just a very important part of a much bigger process.
This is part of one of the things. If you have a little knowledge of something, you start to realize, you either think, oh, I know it all, which we don't, or you start to realize there's so much more to this, which is where listeners, Stuart's guides are absolutely indispensable. It takes you through all of this in the detail that you need. Now, talk about the things that dramas get wrong. I've got an interesting question from Christopher Wills here as well. He says, have you ever learned anything useful yourself from watching police series on TV or from reading a good police novel? Who's doing it well? Who should we be looking at? Who's doing this really, really well out there?
Well, I think nowadays things have changed ever so slightly because a lot of the TV programs, talking TV, if you look at the credits at the end, and I've got a habit of doing this, like I do with books, I go to the this is how it all started. I went to the acknowledgements in a book. There was nothing in there, and I thought, well, that's an idea. Maybe I could help writers. But TVs, I always watch the acknowledgement as a police advisor, and often you'll find these days that there is a police advisor, and there's more recent. I watched one last night called The Bay, which is particularly good. It's very recent. It's up to date. There's another one called Unforgotten. And of course, one of the most popular ones is something called Line of Duty, which you may well have heard of. Line of Duty is procedurally very good, although there's obviously bits loaded onto it for the drama, so it's a bit kind of over the top in a way. But from a procedure point of view, it's bang on. Because I remember sitting and watching the last series of Line of Duty, and I had to laugh because in the first couple of minutes, they threw. And bearing in mind, the police love acronyms. They just love acronyms. And they threw about 6 or 7 acronyms into this sentence. And I don't know whether you watch a program called Gogglebox, but they tend to review TV programs. And literally, it was a show of Gogglebox watching Line of Duty, and they're just looking at each other saying, What's this thing called a chiz? What is a chiz? Well, a chiz is what used to be a snout or an informant, someone that gives information for reward. But it was just this one sentence in Line of Duty, which was like, can you do this, that, and that, and get hold of the chiz and get it graded A1 on the matrix? And it was like, that's a different language. To most people, that is a completely different language. So I think you've just got to find the balance so you don't overload it. But yeah, certainly those dramas I've mentioned. And again, there's a lot of ex-police officers that write books now as well, and a lot of people who've worked in the legal system. I know a couple of people who are ex barristers, so they know the kind of law. They don't. I think the secret to it all, I always say to people, is a little police procedure is good. It helps the authenticity. But if you put too much on it, it becomes a reference book, and it becomes quite dull. So you're absolutely right what you say. A little knowledge is dangerous. But in a police procedural approach, a little of the correct terminology and procedure can actually sell that book to somebody to make them think that you actually know a lot more than you probably do. So it kind of works both ways, really. But yeah, there are some things out there, more so the modern ones. When you go back a bit more, 10, 15, 20 years, there were still police advisors, but not so many. And you then tended to find that things weren't quite right. But it's certainly a very popular. I mean, there's so many programs on now. We might touch on it later, Mark, but I was going to say I've got some of the true crime programs and the real fly on the walls that I'll mention, where I would say if you're looking to gen up on your police procedure, watch these programs, because you're actually watching the officers while they're at work, and you can pick up the language and the terminology and all that sort of thing. And it really is well worth. I still watch them now, even though I've left the police now, because obviously my knowledge needs to be bang up to date, because people are asking me questions about what's happening now, and I don't work in that environment. So I've got to make sure that I give them the right advice. Certainly worth doing.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned acronyms there, which I'm going to jump forward to a question from Queve McDonald, who's asking about codes and call signs. He says, is there any way to find out what codes and call signs that police forces use on radios, and are those standard across all forces? Now, Queve, I know, is, writes very, very good, contemporary crime novels. He really does his research. If he's baffled by this, it must be really tricky to find these things out. So is this top secret information? Is this sort of thing we're allowed to divulge, sort of call signs and codes?
Call signs are a little bit tricky, but you can still find the information out. Call signs are one of those things alongside tactics and the way that the police actually do things that aren't things that they publicly put out to people. But having said that, and I'm sure that the gentleman that you've referred to has probably done this anyway, but if he does some research on the internet and Googles it already, he may have done so already, but I did it this morning on police call signs. There's a website there that gives you the control room call signs. So, Lincolnshire, the Met, places like that, they've got their own, the Metropolitan Police, their control room, who take the 999 calls, they call themselves, surprisingly enough, for the Metropolitan Police, MP. It's the initials for Metropolitan Police. So if it's just a brief example, if they're putting a transmission out to all units in an area in the Met, it would be something like all units from MP. So that's what they call themselves. Obviously, the units that are out on patrol have got their own call signs as well. There is a Wikipedia entry which shows you all the different police forces in the UK and what their force control room call sign is. Right. And there is some information on there. And it's not impossible to find the information out. But as I mentioned before, there are some TV programs. It kind of depends on whether you're going to base it on a real place, because that's quite important. My advice would be, if you're struggling, just make one up, but make sure it's two. Just make sure it's two letters. Because it's fiction at the end of the day, and as long as it looks correct. But if you want the realism, there are things on the internet that you can find. But the TV programs I would mention are programs like, there's a program called Traffic Cops. Now, Traffic Cops moves around the country. At the moment, it's set in North Yorkshire. Now, it does feature the roads policing, the traffic cops, as the name suggests. Mm-hmm. But when you watch it, you will hear the officers using their own call signs. You will hear the control room talking to them and assigning them to a road traffic collision or something, and they'll be involved in car chases. So traffic cops, police interceptors is another one. Anything to do with the police. There's been lots on recently. There was one called Night Coppers, which was based in Brighton, and they followed the uniform officers around the streets. These things are brilliant for research purposes, because you can hear them talking. Yeah. And again, if the individual that you referred to is really struggling, they can always contact me, and I can do so. Yes. I obviously have a bit more of the in-depth knowledge. I can do some research, and I might know the answers for them. So if they want to contact me and let me know what the kind of issue is. So call signs is, you can find it out, but it's not as obvious. It's not really as obvious. You can also make Freedom of Information Act requests to the police asking for information. And I've seen some of them in the past where people wanted to know how many officers patrol this area and what are their call signs. And I think sometimes it really depends on the force policy as to what the reply is, whether they give them that information or whether they say, look, we don't give call signs out. Generally, as a rule, they don't. But again, it depends on the force, and it depends on the people that you speak to. I know, again, we might touch on it, but there was a great question from someone called Tracy Montague about, if we touch on that again, I'll go into the detail about how valuable it can be to just do just that.
Well, let's jump to that. Tracy says, for someone not previously in the police or prison game, would you recommend visiting police stations or prisons for research purposes? And is it easy to arrange? There are a few police and prison scenes in my work in progress, so I hope to arrange some such experiences. And is there a TV series in the UK that's realistic for this? So actually visiting police stations and prisons, it's not like you get guided tours to these things, is it?
No, it's not. I just deal with prisons first of all, because that's my kind of specialist area. I would say definitely, if you want to do it, please try. But again, like I said, with the call signs and the freedom of information, it really depends on which force you approach, who you manage to speak to, and kind of literally almost what's happening on that particular day. It's really, I was in charge of major crime in the East Midlands area. And I had a number of writers come to me, and I'd let them spend the day with the unit, because I think it's important that it's portrayed in the right way. And if you don't, I just think it's helpful. And there was obviously you're not allowed to give sensitive information out or anything like that. But I think it's great. And I know of a few other writers who actually work with police forces, and they've got an individual that they go to, and they'll tell them what they need to know, or they'll point them in the right direction. So definitely I'd say to Tracy, please do it. I can't guarantee the success rate, of course, but make that phone call or go in personally and visit them. What I would suggest is start with the media or the press department. They're the people that deal with the public, and they put the appeals and the bulletins out. It's a good place to start, because they're the kind of media relations department. And just tell them what you need, because I've written in one of our guides that, the only way you can really think what a custody suite's like and what a cell is like is to actually see it for yourself, experience the sights and the sounds and the smells and the environment and what it's like. I'm not saying, some people have even gone in and said, put me in a cell for 10 minutes, shut the door and let me just experience what's going on. And obviously, if it's possible, I'm sure the police would do that. So please do make that approach. If you want to just find out a little bit more about them without the actual personal visit, then they've all got websites these days, and there's loads of information on an individual police force website. And of course, they're all very up with social media now, so they've all got their own Facebook pages and Twitter pages. But certainly, make that approach, because it could make all the difference. Prisons is a little bit more different, because obviously there's a security aspect. But again, don't be afraid to contact them. Try and find out, just ring them up. Just ring the prison up. I wouldn't necessarily go straight to the governor. I'd make the approach to the prison, see who answers the phone, just explain who you are and what you do and what you're trying to achieve. would it be possible if I could spend an hour there or a couple of hours, or even just come and talk to a member of staff about what it's like in the prison? Because I think it's just one of those things that if you get the chance to experience it, it's going to make such a difference to the way that you write those particular scenes and the information that you include. So yeah, go for it, definitely, and try and get that opportunity to sample these sort of things for yourself firsthand.
That's brilliant advice. And of course, you get authors like I remember Martina Cole would go and read in prisons or teach in prisons. Talk about creative writing as well. So you sort of, you get to meet the prisoners too, and maybe get some feedback from them on the conditions in prisons and what it's really, really like. So
yeah. My friend and co-author Stephen Wade is a crime historian, and he's working at HMP Hull at the moment, and he used to be a writer in residence at a prison. So, and he writes about true crime. So, like you say, you get the first-hand experience. Then he was working with inmates and prisoners. Now he's working with the staff as well. But it's something that's such a, like you say, if you get the chance to do it, it's a real experience. And it kind of, I think we all have perceptions because it's based on what we see on the TV and what we hear and what we read. But when you've actually sampled it for yourself and experienced it, sometimes it changes your view on it, and it gives you that much more rounded approach to be able to write something a bit more realistic, if you like.
Yeah. Now you mentioned true crime there, and earlier you mentioned true crime documentaries and the ones that maybe we should be watching. I mean, is there anything in particular that you recommend that's particularly good on procedure and giving us that kind of rounded view of things?
Yeah, I think a lot of the ones I mentioned before there are certainly, because they also cover arresting people and taking them to the police station. So you'll see the custody environment. There's so many that appear. There are programs that they're a little bit historical, but if you look on like the Sky channels, you'll find ones called The Force. So you'll have the Force 6, the Force Manchester, the Force Northeast, and you've got other kind of programs around policing. There's lots of police programs on there. There's one that I would definitely recommend that's on. It was on recently, and it comes on every now and again. It's on Channel 4, and it's called very simply 24 Hours in Police Custody. And that follows various different cases. It might be a serious assault out on the street. It might be somebody arrested. But it's the investigation all the way through. And what you do see there, which you don't often see these days, is you see the interview in progress. So you'll see the officers and the suspect and the solicitor in the interview room because it's all recorded on video, and you'll hear what they say. You'll see them switching the machine on, the DVD player, and you'll hear them give the person a caution. And, there's just so much information in there that you can gather. And again, it shows you how it actually happens in reality. And it's well worth. So 24 Hours in Police Custody, certainly. And on prisons, I watched one the other day about Wormwood Scrubs. So again, on sort of Channel 4, Channel 5, and some of the Sky channels, you'll often see sort of 9-10 o'clock at night, there's a program about a prison. It might be Broadmarsh, it might be something like that. So, and they actually in the prison themselves, and they interview the staff, they interview people that are serving lengthy sentences, and those are the sort of ones where you'll really get to see, images of what the prison inside looks like, what it's like spending so many hours in a cell, and the experiences of those people who are detained in those establishments. So there is quite a lot, and I'm sure the internet is exactly the same. YouTube and various other channels will probably give you some of those experiences as well. So there's quite a lot out there in actual fact that you can sort of dip in and out of and just get an idea of what things are really like.
Excellent. I mean, some of those shows, there's, and this comes on to a question from Lily Morris, some of those shows are now sort of tagged as a genre called copaganda, where people maybe feel that they're maybe too biased in the police's favour. And Lily's asking, how should writers in the genre avoid that kind of propaganda? Writing with an awareness of ongoing policing issues, particularly, I mean, we're seeing a lot of stuff in the news now about institutional racism and sexism. These are, as we say, they're institutional things. The police is made up of individuals. There are bad apples. There's how aware are writers of that now, and what are the pitfalls and what are the things we should be looking out for?
Yeah, I think there's obviously a huge awareness now, and I've started picking up already on some of the advice that I'm giving that writers are starting to include some of these issues in their writing. So they may have a corrupt officer, they may have an officer who's treating people badly, all those sort of issues that are now coming to light. I did say once to somebody that when I joined the police in the 80s, it was a bit like Life on Mars. I don't know. That's another program that you may have seen, which is it's fiction, but there were certain things in there in terms of the way that the detectives behaved that I could kind of recognize some of those things from when I joined in the 80s. Thankfully, we'd moved away from that, but now with this new Casey report and everything that's quite rightly been uncovered, particularly in London, there's some real issues there. I've just made a brief note on this question because I think it's a really good question. The way I've written it is that you could approach this in kind of two ways. One is that you're writing fiction, so you may want to just completely avoid these issues altogether. Yeah. People find that easier to do it because their knowledge of what goes on, if you haven't got the people to tap into to get how it really has happened and how it works, then you might want to just avoid it altogether. Your most important thing for writing your books is your plot, your characters, and the enjoyment of the reader. The police procedure bolts onto that, but it's not the be all and end all, and the culture is exactly the same. So that's an approach that some people might think, well, why should I avoid it? Why would I avoid it? But it's an option, and it's one that you shouldn't forget. If you're really struggling with it and you're thinking, I don't want to write this in this way because it might appear either not critical enough or too critical, then don't do it. Just write the book as you want to write it and use the characters. But the second part I've made is just go for it, tackle it head on, and actually cover those issues. Have your misogynistic detective or your sergeant or whoever you want, because it's fiction and it's very topical. Of course it is. And include it in your book. Put those issues in your book. What I would suggest to people is, if you get the opportunity, read the Casey report. I just downloaded it yesterday from the internet. It's available on there. There is certainly on Twitter. There's a Casey kind of a page on there. If you just put Casey in, I think, or Casey report, have a read of it. It's like 400 pages. It's worth reading because it brings you bang up to date with what's been found recently. And it might give you some kind of ideas around writing it. Maybe obviously not the same, but very similar, because you're writing fiction, but of course you might want it to mirror what's happening in society and in policing at the moment. So go for it. And if you're struggling for specifics, or you want to know a little bit more about those cultural issues, then try and do some research. But again, I'm no expert in this, but I know what things were like when I joined. I know what things appear to be like in certain parts of policing now, and I know the challenges that lie ahead. So, contact someone like me and let me. You mentioned earlier on about looking at how I do my work. Well, often it's by reading people's chapters, maybe sometimes the whole book, and other times it's answering specific questions. I've also done quite a bit of work recently on the phone as well, because you can cover a lot of ground on a phone, whereas, typing things backwards and forwards can take ages, especially for me, especially for someone that types as badly as I do. So, tackle it head on. It's your work. I appreciate there's some sensitivities in it, but this is now in the public domain. These are issues that need to be, they don't need to be swept under the carpet any longer. They need to be aired, discussed, highlighted, and what better way than to put it in a book? It's I'm sure people will be going down that line. And if you have got a character that's like that, you can write it however you like. This character may well get suspended. There's all sorts of issues about the misconduct then as well. How does that sort of thing work? Do police officers get suspended? What happens to them at the end of the day? So that you can you can go where you want to with it, and don't be afraid of it. Use it as a kind of tool in your toolbox to write what you really want to write.
Excellent advice. Thank you very much, Stuart. I've got a sort of quick fire round of questions from Christopher Wills, who I suspect he's writing a novel. We've got some quite specific questions from him. So if we can whiz through those. Christopher says, is there a difference in police procedures for a uniform arriving at the scene of a body and a detective arriving at the scene of a body first? So, if a uniformed officer arrives and finds a body, or a detective, is the procedure any different, or is it much the same?
No, it's pretty similar. For body, we'll talk suspicious death, possible murder, because that's where everything will start to kick into play. So it's the same, really. What you'll often find is that it will often be probably more often than not, it'll be a uniformed officer that arrives at the scene, because they get the call from a member of the public, and they're in the response cars, and they'll go in a marked car and they'll find what they find, and then they'll deal with it. Detectives, it would be rare for them to arrive first. It has happened. It does happen if they happen to be in the area, or they come across a situation because they're out on inquiries, then it could very well be a detective. What I'd say about the detectives is, generally speaking, because they're a detective, they will be probably a little bit more experienced. So they'll have the knowledge of who to call and what to do. But very simply, obviously, it's not simple when you're there faced with it, especially if you're inexperienced. There are a number of things that a uniformed officers have to do, but one of them is call on the radio and tell their control room what's going on and keep them well up to date. And they will be given advice along the way. But I've just made a note of 4 things which are the most important things at this sort of situation. One is obviously saving life. Now, if the person has died and you've either rendered first aid or you can't, then you move forward to the next stage. But preservation of life is the priority in everything that the police do. And in a case like this, it's no different. So preservation of life, you need to secure the scene. So where this place is, as we mentioned before, you don't want anybody to contaminate it any more than it already has been. So you need to try and do something with that scene, whether it's putting tape up, whether it's putting physical barriers like bins or whatever. It's just to prevent anybody from contaminating that scene. You need to identify witnesses, and this is something that you're taught when you go to training school. They put you through these mock scenarios, at the back of the training school, where something happens and there you go, that's yours, you go and deal with that. And the first thing you normally have to say is, did anybody see what happened? Because there might be somebody across the road that doesn't want to get involved, or it's just about to walk away, and suddenly you've got yourself a witness. So you try and find your witnesses, and obviously the last one is very important as well. Identifying these suspects. Are they still nearby? Suspects have a habit, even in murder cases, of hanging around and seeing what's going on, blending into the crowd and asking questions of the officers. If we think back to Ian Huntley with the Sower murders, he was doing press interviews on Sky News and all sorts of things. He was getting involved in the searches for the 2 girls, and even though he knew that he'd killed them and obviously knew what had gone on. So you do sometimes find that suspects will either stay at the scene or return to the scene. So you really have to have your wits about you and keep an eye on any suspicious activity. But in answer to Christopher's question, in a nutshell, there isn't really a lot of difference. You've just got to set the wheels in motion and make sure that you secure evidence and deal with it as best you can until support arrives from wherever it comes from. Yeah.
Brilliant. Another one from Christopher. Does police procedure vary from station to station, and does it evolve much as time goes by? I guess, if you're booking in prisoners, it's pretty much the same everywhere you go, is it?
Yeah, I'd say things like custody procedure, booking in prisoners, it's the same. I mean, obviously, if you venture into Scotland, you've got a whole new ball game, because Scottish law is different from English. So Scotland's different, but England, Wales, and most of Ireland, custody procedure is very similar. There's something called PACE, which is the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. It's a big bit of legislation. It came in the mid-80s, and it governs most things that happen in relation to stop search, prisoners, interviews, everything. So PACE applies to England and Wales and parts of Ireland. But local policies will be different. So my policy in my police area, to do with how you view CCTV, whose authority you need to get the CCTV footage, it might be different to another force area. Things like digital media, so examination of mobile phones. This is all in the last few years that this is coming to light. They probably have different local policies, but you're absolutely right in what you say. The bigger procedures, custody, missing persons are generally very similar across forces, because missing people often go from one force area to another. So you have to have a pretty similar procedure so that everybody knows what they're doing and they do it correctly. Local policies are different, procedures. And of course, yes, they do evolve. They do evolve over time as the law changes, as guidance changes. Digital media being a prime example. There was a time when there was very little. What you had to send a mobile phone away to a company for it to be downloaded and examined. Now, most forces have their own department and team, and you just give them the phone and say, can you download the contents of this phone? And even if it's PIN protected or locked, there's often technology that they can access that can get into that phone. Whereas I remember a good few years ago, I was in charge of a murder case, and the suspect had a BlackBerry and it was locked. And they obviously knew the number because they'd used it recently, but they wouldn't tell us the number. Right. And I remember I had to send it across to Canada because that was where it was made. And they struggled to get into it. I mean, going back a few years now, well, I don't think that would happen now. Literally, there's some technology available to access most computers and phones and things, digital devices. So when that comes in, there's a new local policy that obviously evolves over time. So yeah, things do change, and you've got to kind of keep on top of what's current at the moment.
So this is just something that occurs to me. Writers are quite morbid. So if I go for a walk and I think if I'm found in a ditch and you found my phone, you'd be able to identify me from my phone by unlocking.
Should be able to. Good. Yeah. Yes. If it's locked, they should be able to get into it, and then obviously they can then access the contents. So all your internet usage, your photos, your videos, your call list, your contact list, all of those things. That should in reality happen. I'd be very surprised in this day and age if there was a device out there that where that couldn't happen, if you like. Excellent. So yeah, from that point of view, it's very reassuring, as well as the fact that it's used for criminal investigation as well.
And last question from Christopher: what does police procedure say about an officer accidentally meeting former criminals in public? I imagine it's quite an awkward encounter, but is there any kind of formal procedure on that?
It could be awkward, depending on the former criminal and what the circumstances were. There isn't anything specific. The word I picked out of that question was accidental. So yes. This is not a prearranged meeting, either in a pub or somewhere else. It's literally bumping into, and it's a former criminal. All I'd say with that is, what the officer should do afterwards is make a report when they get back to the station. It's called an intelligence report. So it's basically officers are submitting intelligence all the time. If I'm a police officer and I go out and I see a known burglar driving a car that I didn't realize he had, then I'm going to make a note of the index number and make a model of that. And I'm going to do a check on it, and then I'm going to submit what they call an intelligence report on the computer to let everybody know that this particular criminal is now driving this car. So if it's involved in a burglary tonight and somebody's got the index number, they can link it all together like a jigsaw puzzle. So an accidental meeting with a former criminal, I would suggest probably submit an intelligence report, because actually that former criminal might be an organised criminal who lived elsewhere in the country, has just moved to the area, and it's important for the officers and staff of this area to know that maybe they're in this area now, and they might be committing crime. They may not be, but they might be. And if there's any conversation, if anything happens criminally, so if the officer is threatened, or if somebody else is threatened, or if there's something that happens that might lead to some kind of suggestion of wrongdoing by the officer, then they need to speak to their supervisor when they get back to the station, just to say, look, I've just been down to Marks and Spencer's to get a tuna sandwich, and look who come up behind me and said, boom, 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 boom. Yeah. And then, that it's basically just documenting it so that there's a record of that meeting, even though it's not prearranged, it's happened. And if somebody needs to access that information, because what happens is that person's name will be logged. And then if anybody looks at that person's record in the future, they can see that on this date, at this time, at this location, they bumped into DC Jones, who was out doing whatever he or she was doing. So yeah, not a lot really. It's not a big deal unless something happens and there's a threat or something like that. If it's a simple accidental meeting, then no big deal, but just document the fact.
And you mentioned a car's index number. Is that what we're calling registration numbers these days?
Yeah, index numbers is probably, registration numbers is a term that's used as well, but index is the big one. One thing I forgot to mention, Mark, when the lady was asking about, can't remember who it was, asking about codes, station codes and things. Yeah. The police use something called the phonetic alphabet. Mm-hmm. And what that is, and I think military use it as well and various other organizations. And it's basically, if I'm sending something over the radio, say I've stopped Mark Stay in the street, and I want to do a check on him to see what his previous convictions are, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to, when I ask for the check, I'm not going to say to control, I need a check on Mark Stay. What I'm going to say is I'm going to spell your name out phonetically. So I'm going to say it's Mike Alpha Romeo Kilo for Mark, Sierra Tango Alpha Yankee. And what it is, it's a way of making sure that the control room don't misinterpret what I say. So if I say B, and they think I say E, for example, then that's not a good thing. So that's another thing when we talk about call signs, the phonetic alphabet. So police are always, when they're doing checks on vehicles and people, and when they're reading out street names and other information, they're always using the phonetic alphabet to back it up, so that whoever they're talking to doesn't kind of misinterpret it. I've gone off track there, but it just came to me just as we were talking about registration numbers.
I'm very glad. I've learned so much listening to you, Stuart. Folks, You can find out more about Stuart and his services at gibconsultancy.co.uk. I'm going to put a link in the show notes. I got a feeling this is just the tip of the iceberg. His books are available online. I'll put a link so you can discover more about those as well. Stuart, thank you so much for this. It's been brilliant. It's been absolutely fascinating and answering our listener questions. And it's I'm sure I'll be in touch, and lots of our listeners will be in touch soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for inviting me. Enjoyed it. Thank you.